And are we degenerate in a profoundly threatening manner?
What?
I think the answer to that may well be yes. The idea that we are ensconced in a culture war has become a rhetorical commonplace. Is it serious enough to increase the probability that Russia, say, will be motivated to invade and potentially incapacitate Ukraine merely to keep the pathological West out of that country?
No. No. Jordan Peterson made a video covering the war in Ukraine. I don't know why he did it. Again, I'm pretty sure his wheelhouse is psychology. But again, I'm a Twitch streamer, so I don't really have much room to talk. But he's made a video on the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And he titled it, Russia versus Ukraine or Civil War in the West. And I'm very interested in what he has to say. It's been recommended to me all day in my DMs. People have been trying to get me to watch it. And so I'm finally going to watch it. It's only been a day, so you can stop hounding me now. You'll never predict where he goes with this. Is this going to be one of those things where he's like, man, Russia invaded Ukraine. Tragedy, massive L, that really sucks. But you want to know what? This reminds me of the ancient philosophic teachings of Bingigi from the 12th century when he said, man, women, they suck. He's going along this line, he's talking about the issue, and then out of nowhere, he's going to make a left turn and he's talking about some philosophic nerd from like 2th century BCE that was around before Russia or Ukraine even existed. It's even more lame than that. Okay, we'll just watch it.
Hi, everyone. I want to read a piece for you today that I wrote recently over about a month, carefully assessing it with a number of experts on foreign policy. It's called Russia versus Ukraine, or Civil War in the West. We are now several months into the conflict with Russia. I say we, because we are all pretending here in the West that the real war is between Russia and Ukraine, but nod, nod, wink, wink, if we clandestinely, in some sense, provide full support to Ukraine, maybe the Russians, foolish and backward as they are, won't notice, and we can simultaneously pretend that we aren't flirting with the prospect of a long, arduous, and inconceivably destructive war.
This is weird, because to say that we're flirting with war, this is a Russian talking point. This is the Russian state talking point. It has been for a while. That America will fight to the last Ukrainian, which suggests that without America, Ukraine wouldn't be fighting, that we're the ones dragging them along into combat. And if we weren't involved, the suffering would end with a swift Russian victory, and the Ukrainian people would shrug their shoulders and just have to accept the new reality. And eventually down the line, Ukraine would be prosperous within the Russian Volk, the Russian people, within the Russian state. And they'd all be happy little Russians, as the Kurds are happy, as they are called Mountain Turks in Turkey, and suppressed in their own unique way. But I think this also denies the fact that Ukrainians would most likely fight with or without us. We just give them a better fighting chance with our support. This also ignores the fact that Russia has, for years upon years upon years, suppressed the Ukrainian people and have tried to deny their very identity. I think it was Dmitry Medvedev who even called Ukraineness a disease of the mind. It was the Russian Tsardom which banned the Ukrainian language and made many Ukrainian intellectuals flee to Austro-Hungary because they wanted to, have a decent education. So I feel like this kind of is a little disconnected, as if it was us, the West, who will perpetuate this war, and without us, the suffering would simply end. Where I think really the difference is we give the Ukrainians a fighting chance against the suffering, and we give them an opportunity to throw off the shackles of occupation. I mean, we could say this about any number of conflicts in history, couldn't we? We could say this about the struggle against the Germans as they invaded Russia, and we decided to send land leases over to the Russians, or a land lease to the British, or a land lease to any number of the Allies before we formally entered the Second World War. This would be true of any moral war or immoral war we've been involved in. So I don't know. It feels a little like pointless to bring up. I just don't understand.
I have spoken publicly on my YouTube channel and podcast with American foreign policy expert Frederick Kagan who was recommended to me by some of my conservative associates in the US, people with extensive political experience and simultaneously knowledge about foreign policy. Kagan is rather hawkish in his outlook and reputation, and was criticized for this, as I was for hosting him, in the social media comments section accompanying my YouTube channel. Our joint episodes, by the way, have been viewed or listened to by at least 3 million people. I'm saying this just to provide evidence that these discussions have had some impact in the broad public sphere. Dr. Kagan essentially put forward the thesis that Vladimir Putin is a prototypical authoritarian, and that Russia's foray into Ukraine might be properly viewed as an expression of the imperial expansionism that characterized the Soviet Union. So this is Cold War round 2. This perspective, which appears to characterize what might be called the Western patriotic response to the Russian incursion, has its very real justifications. It appears part of uniting in response to an enemy, part of justifying what is necessarily a binary decision process. Are we at war or not? If yes, then the question arises, is the enemy bad? By definition. Otherwise, the war is unpardonable. And if we believe that to be the case, we will enter the fray demoralized and compromise our chances of victory. But one of the primary justifications for a war, perhaps, is that we have something to gain. I see that we have little to gain in the current situation, and certainly much we could lose. Russia is a nuclear power, and we run the very real risk of backing them into a corner.
A lot of people, and I hope that this doesn't lead down this route because I can see this frame of thinking already for me. A lot of people will compare this war to the German war during the First World War, right? The Treaty of Versailles is brought up. Is it a topic of conversation? The same way that it is brought up here. So the difference between, and this also comes up when it comes around to the idea of humiliating Putin, which I am in the camp of. I am in the humiliate camp, at least when it comes to Russian interests in Ukraine. And the reason why I'm in that camp, and the reason why I think the comparison to the Treaty of Versailles is silly, is because the Treaty of Versailles and Western demands on Ukraine could not be further apart. The Treaty of Versailles set a limit on the German military. It set a limit on what troops could be where within German territory. You got to keep those troops off the Rhine. It set huge amount of reparations in place for the Germans to have to pay back. It also carved out what was currently German territory when it comes to what was historically Prussian land and et cetera, et cetera. The return of Alsace-Lorraine to France and all this other stuff, et cetera, et cetera. It led to the loss of one of Germany's premier allies of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was completely shattered. It put limits on the forming of the new technology that made up the German Air Force. And so the Germans actually had to kind of practice with gliders for a lot of years because they didn't want to break the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And when eventually the big crash came along, the Depression, all of these economic costs when it comes to reparations hit Germany even harder, which eventually led to a French occupation of certain parts of the country. I mean, the Treaty of Versailles wasn't just a humiliation of Germany. It was gutting Germany. It was smacking it around and shoving its face in the dirt, taking German land, German money, limiting the German military. I mean, it was all across the board. Is any of that at all comparable to Western demands on Ukraine? What are Western demands of Ukraine? Number 1, stop the invasion. Number 2, leave Ukraine. We're not saying that Russia must, moving forward, limit its military to this size or disband its air force. Hell, there's not even demands for reparations, which I believe are 100% in order or like in due order. Like this is something that would be 100% morally correct. We're not going to abolish the existence of Belarus, okay, when like Austro-Hungary, which disappeared, in the casualties involved here, or to a much smaller extent. These wars and these treaties aren't comparable. But people try to like act like humiliating Russia by just telling them to go home, pack your bags, leave the country you're currently invading. But this comes from people whose only understanding of foreign policy is World War I, World War II, and that's it. So you got to compare everything to the Nazis, and you got to compare everything to World War I, which I've even had to do because it's the only way to explain things to people, because they just don't understand foreign policy outside of that, when this is much more comparable, in my opinion, to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And we all know what the result of that was, if you're a longtime viewer of the channel. So no, I don't think that humiliating Russia risks backing them into a corner when they have nuclear weapons here. Because backing them into a corner would be like, okay, if you want to leave and end the war, you also got to give up protections on Belarus. And, you know, this Kaliningrad stuff, I believe that's always been Lithuanian soil. Also, you got to limit your military. That would be something comparable.
Many people watching my exchange with Dr. Kagan suggested that I broaden my understanding by reviewing the work of Dr. John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, who offers...
It's always John Mearsheimer, because John Mearsheimer, this is why people know about John Mearsheimer, because John Mearsheimer, okay, has a popular YouTube video. That's the reason why John Mearsheimer has always come up in this conversation, even though many of his conclusions about the conflict have already come up to be wrong. But whatever, we'll do a whole video on John Mearsheimer's video on Ukraine and Russia and his commentary on NATO and Russia in the future, because I believe his thinking and understanding of the conflict is very flawed.
Dr. Mearsheimer's remarkably prescient 2015 University of Chicago lecture, Why is Ukraine the West's Fault?, available on YouTube and now watched by 30 million people, an unheard.
That's why he gets brought up all the time, because that video has gotten over 30 million views.
In a singularly lucid 1-hour presentation, Mearsheimer explained that NATO and European Union expansionism into Ukraine, the invitation proffered to Ukraine to join the EU, the formal statement of the desirability of NATO's extension into Ukraine, has already and will continue to pose an intolerable threat to the Russians, who view Ukraine both as an integral part of the broader Russian sphere of interest, and as a necessary buffer between the Europe that has invaded Russia to terrible effect in 1812 and 1941, and that is no more trustworthy to Russian eyes now than previously.
The problem is, though, when we talk about this idea of NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, into formerly occupied territory that was occupied by the Soviet Union and had many governments forced upon it, right? And then when they tried to establish their own independence, whether it be in Czechoslovakia or Hungary, the Russians sent in tanks and smashed them down and told them this idea of freedom or Western-style democracy was a silly bedtime story that shouldn't be really adopted by these countries. Once the Soviet Union collapsed and these countries had their opportunity, it wasn't as if NATO, and this is the Russian model of expansion, it wasn't as if NATO marched its armies into the rest of Eastern Europe and then absorbed them into NATO. That isn't what happened. What happened was that these newly elected governments in these formerly Soviet states came to NATO and requested to join NATO. Now, you can have whatever opinion in the world you want about NATO, but it's not like NATO marched across Europe, conquering one country after the other until it arrived at the border of Ukraine, and Ukraine was simply the next country on the list. It's almost the other way around, where these countries went to NATO and basically begged. And I don't say this in a very kind of like flamboyant or like just off the cuff way. I mean, their governments almost quite literally begged to be part of NATO, because the governments in Hungary, even now with Viktor Orban's leadership, in Poland, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all these countries knew that the year was 1991, 92, 93, that the Russians were down, but the Russians are never out, And so one day the Russians could come back. And Russian chauvinism, as it is wearing its ugly head right now in Ukraine, could come back. And at the time, this was the comparison people would make, their cities might soon look like Grozny and Chechnya when they tried to assert some independence themselves, and they were repaid for this, level of independence seeking, even if the people who were seeking independence didn't follow the same ideological framework I did, were repaid for that with blood, terror, and destruction with artillery bombardments as they flattened the city and used car park tactics, i.e. turning their cities into giant fucking car parks. And so it wasn't like NATO went across Europe conquering and pillaging and raping, right? It was more that the countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union did not want to anymore be part of a Russian alliance. And so they left. And Ukraine was inevitably one of those countries. So I don't think that when we talk about NATO expansionism, we really paint the whole picture by just saying, oh, NATO expanded, the same way, Russia expanded, and then it was all not Gucci. Because it was more that NATO expanded at the request of the countries that they were expanded into.
Mearsheimer states starkly, and this explains a fair bit of Putin's potential motivation, that Russia would rather see Ukraine destroyed, razed to the ground, than comfortably ensconced in the Western sphere of influence.
That's true.
And Mearsheimer said that not last month or last week in response to the Ukraine incursion, but 7 years ago in 2015.
But the thing is, what's being argued right here when he talks about like American Monroe Doctrine is if you look at America's relationship with Latin America, it can at many times be described as extremely, unbelievably abusive. But at times, we've had to learn to live with certain realities in Latin America. One of the most stark ones that we had to learn to live with, definitely after the Bay of Pigs, was the existence of communism in Cuba. We had to learn to live with it. We knew that Cuba, post the ousting of the former government and the installation of communism in Cuba, was a government that's no longer friendly to our interests. That was not going to host our missiles, was not going to host our troops, and was not friendly to Western interests. But we also knew that a Western-aligned Cuba did not seem to be what was popular at the time, at least within Cuba. Even if you have problems with the Castro regime, if you ask Cubans, would you rather have a Western puppet or a Western-aligned leader, many would still say no, even if you have problems with the Castro regime, because, national sovereignty over foreign domination is something that rings true all over the world, right? This idea of can you have freedom without national liberation? Usually not. That's usually not the case. And so if you compare something like that to Ukraine, I could simply respond by saying that this is a reality that Russia might have to learn to live with. We learned to live with it. The Russians are going to have to actually learn to live with it. Also, when it comes to this idea of NATO expansionism, that this invasion was extremely counterproductive because all this invasion resulted in, when it comes to the number of NATO countries, was an expansion of them. Primarily two that has been in the news a lot lately, Sweden and Finland. So this invasion didn't even necessarily serve Russian interests. This is what we call blowback.
Mearsheimer also claims that the Ukraine president, Yanukovych, deposed in 2014 in the aftermath of widespread pro-EU protests, was the clear favorite and choice of the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, who overwhelmingly occupy the southeastern section of the country, while Zelensky, the current president and supporter of all things Western, was and is supported by the Ukrainian speakers who live in the northeast.
That sounds like a 1-hour lecture thing to say about Ukraine, and this is also my problem with John Mearsheimer and a lot of people who tout him as their source on all things Ukraine, is that John Mearsheimer very much simplifies how we talk about Ukrainian politics, as in, oh, you're a Russian speaker, you support this guy. You're a Ukrainian speaker, you support this guy. This, of course, ignores the fact, for example, that Volodymyr Zelensky was somebody who was actually against the famous Russian language bills, which talked about the speaking of the Russian language as a public employee, which became a big issue of contention. He actually opposed that. Why? Because he's a Russian speaker also, drawing these solid lines in the ground about like the Russian speakers support this or the Ukrainian speakers support this. I always think is really extremely simplistic. This would almost be like if we came into the somebody came to America and was like, Mexicans support Hillary. You'd hear that, and even if you look at the statistics and you could find maybe like 60 to 70 to 80% did, as an American, that would feel like a very kind of milquetoast kind of description of American politics. Black people like Joe Biden. White people love Trump. Women love abortion. It's like, this is a very shallow description of politics, and it comes from an extremely shallow knowledge from Ukraine that you would get from a 1-hour lecture where you couldn't get into the complexities of Ukrainian politics. When I went to Zaporozhye, to the front line, and I talked to soldiers, they were all speaking Russian. It was Russian speakers fighting off the Russian army. And if you poll the majority of Ukrainians now, they solidly support Zelensky because it is the Russian speakers who are being hurt the most by the Russian army in Ukraine. It is the Donbass that is seeing the most destruction, the heaviest shelling, the heaviest air bombardment. The same with Kharkiv. All these locations which have high Russian-speaking populations are the ones that are seeing the most destruction from the Russian army, that are seeing the most people displaced from, seeing the most refugees flee from, the most death and the most destruction. And so it's not going to be surprising when the people of Zaporozhye pick up guns and defend their homes against the Russian army.
Putin and the Russians have their reasons for concern over the situation in Ukraine. Russia is a petro giant, providing almost 15% of the world's supply of oil and natural gas, and is extremely dependent on that single resource, whose revenues make up almost 50% of the state budget and perhaps 30% of total GDP. Almost half of the Russian fossil fuels exported make their way to Europe, which has allowed itself to become dangerously dependent on such outside sources for one of its primary necessities. It's not so easy for the Russians to get their oil and gas to market, partly because the behemoth country is remarkably landlocked in a practical sense. They've had to build extensive pipelines to do so. This has produced unending tension in the region, not least around Azerbaijan, which has run its own pipelines to thirsty Western markets through Georgia, invaded non-coincidentally by Russia in 2008. Add to that the fact that 80% of Russia's oil and gas exports once had to pass through Ukraine, although this problem has been remediated somewhat, and the stage was and is set for trouble. It is also the case that Ukraine has immense and relatively recently discovered, circa 2010, petro resources of its own, particularly around the Caspian Sea and in the northeast. Enough natural gas, for example, so that it could have become a major supplier of that resource to Europe, and thereby pose a threat to European reliance on Russian resources. Ukraine also possesses, although perhaps not after the current war.
Can I just say, like, let's just like give him everything he's saying right here, right? Because there's not like too much I necessarily object to about what he's saying right here. I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that I don't know enough about Central Asia. But if the argument does wrap around until it's, hey, Russia wants to continue to dominate the energy market, then that would just be a flagrant authoritarian imperialist reason to invade another country. That you want access and control of said country's resources, and you don't want to compete at a competitive rate on an equal playing field with the rest of the countries in the world when it comes to like trading resources internationally. So I am going to let him just keep spieling this out, but I just do want to clarify that if the picture he's painting here is correct, then this would mean that the Russians invaded for a resource war in at least part of the many reasons they invaded. You could make the argument, well, then the West is involved for resources, partially. I mean, that, let's say that's true, but that would mean the framing of this would be Russia is invading Ukraine in part to control its resources. The West is supporting Ukraine so it can have sovereignty over its own resources, which the West could then have access to. The West would still be the quote unquote, if you want to use simplistic terms, good guys in this scenario, not even out of just some moral, like we're the best, we're the greatest, we support all the good guys, but out of just seeking, even just through seeking their own interests, that still means they're on the right side here. Somebody can be seeking their own interests and still be on the right side of an issue internationally. That happened a lot during the Second World War. A great example of this would be Joseph Stalin, who was on the right side of the Second World War, but that does not make him a moral man, or because he was on the right side for moral reasons. I think the Moscow-Berlin alliance during the 1939, and how they split Poland in half is a good example of the fact that he really wasn't until the Germans invaded.
So that's 3 hypothetical reasons for Russia and Ukraine. First, Putin, the imperialist Soviet-era Hitlerian thug. Second, Russia, threatened by careless and provocative Western expansionism into a country we really don't care about, except when our unearned moral virtue is challenged, but which is key to Russian identity and security. Third, Russian concern about maintaining its primarily petro-funded economy, particularly in relation to the European market. But even 3 reasons are not enough to account for the fact of this war and its emergence here and now. There's a 4th, precisely germane to why I entitled this essay, Civil War in the West.
Is any of the reasons he listed yet, like about Russia's historical relationship with Ukraine, Russia's historical abuse of Ukraine, Russia's continued like determination to say Ukraine is an artificial thing. This Ukrainianness is a disease of the mind. Like none of it has to do with just the blatant like history of Russia's abusive relationship with Ukraine. It's always just, oil and gas, NATO expansionism, even though if you listen to like Russian leadership talk about it, like they'll talk about NATO expansionism, but then they'll say, yeah, I'm Peter the Great. I'm reconquering historically Russian lands. Dmitry Medvedev will kick in and just like kick up the bigotry to overdrive, right? This is never brought up in these explanations. This history, which makes it easier for Russia to convince its population in order to go along with this war, is usually disregarded.
A few weeks ago, one of my viewers or readers or listeners sent me a copy of the great Russian novelist Dostoevsky's A Writer's Diary. Dostoevsky regarded A Writer's Diary, twice the length in its entirety of his longer works of fiction, as his preeminent achievement. It's a hybrid work, which he began publishing as a series of columns in a conservative weekly journal called The Citizen. Dostoevsky concerned himself with a philosophical, or more profoundly, theological issue, the crisis of meaning in the West, addressing an issue that has become of key psychological and social importance again today. Crime and Punishment is a psychological investigation focusing on questions of right and wrong, or good and evil. Are human beings devoid of religious presuppositions, now free to make their own choices, even matters of murder? In The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky asks, is everything permitted now that God is dead? In The Devils, also known as The Possessed, he asks, what forms might belief take, and to what end, when the strictures of traditional belief are burst asunder? What dread demons might take the place of the displaced Yahweh? Dostoevsky fervently believed in the necessity of a revival of Christianity.
This feels like it has nothing, like nearly nothing to do with the war, okay? If this is about to turn into a war between, like, the church and the God, between the God is dead Western crowd who hates God and religion, and that has nothing to do with the war. Every once in a while, you might hear Putin like get up and say, "Oh, we're being canceled like J.K. Rowling," but it's just a propaganda point. It has nothing to do with the fundamental reasons why the war started, which you could Be like Jordan. You could say something like resources. You could say something like access to Black seaports, even though they've basically accomplished that with Crimea. Now with the Moskva sink, I think if anything, they're jeopardizing that. You could say the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine. You could say access to Ukrainian markets. There's a million reasons you could give. None of it has to do with the church or really anything I think he's talking about right now. Like I don't know. I don't know why we're talking about this book. This feels completely unrelated. This feels needlessly pedantic.
Everyone listening to or watching or reading this might be thinking, what could such arcane things possibly have to do with the practicalities of the current war? But that is an indication of our superficiality and ignorance here in the West. When Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote The Gulag Archipelago, the book that shook the foundations of the Cold War era world, he suggested, like Dostoevsky, that it would be necessary for the Russians to return to the path of incremental organic development that had been manifesting itself prior to the revolutionary disruptions of the communist catastrophe. That meant a return to Orthodox belief. Putin himself is, in principle, a practicing Christian. The degree to which Putin's worldview and actions are shaped by his professed Christianity is a topic subject to appropriate debate. But the same can be said about the views and actions of all who adopt or claim to adopt a faith. I certainly feel somewhat more comfortable knowing that Putin regards himself, however indeterminately, as subordinate to something beyond himself.
What is any of this? I mean, the only element I think that this has to do with faith is the split between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is much more recent, and the Russian Orthodox Church. But that split has only been worsened. Just keep going. Okay. I'm sorry. I don't know what any of this is.
Regardless of the depth or genuineness of his belief, however, it is beyond dispute that the Russian leader frequently speaks of his country's role as a bulwark against the moral decadence of the West, and that he speaks in philosophical and theological terms to a degree unthinkable in a Western leader, all of whom tend towards a condescension in such matters.
This is a talking point that is said by the Russian government often, that they are the true bulwark of Christianity in the modern world. They're the ones that are conservative. They don't let those damn dirty homos, get married here. We beat them in the street like they're supposed to be. We don't allow any of this nonsense when it comes to feminism and stuff, right? Look at us. We're in a country you can properly beat your wife under the new legislation that makes it easier, okay? But I don't think that any of the reasons fundamentally have to do with this. And if it does have to do with this, then this only further strengthens the Ukrainian position. A country trying to force its perspective about religion, its relationship to homosexualities, women, and how you should run your everyday life onto another people, which is trying to enforce its own sovereignty. And that's not even to say that Ukrainians and Russians have that different of an interpretation of the Christian faith. They're both Orthodox, and there are differences when it comes to Ukraine being less homophobic generally, the polling data seems to suggest, and it is moving faster in the right direction. But there's not much in this war that is connected to faith. I just don't understand this hard emphasis on faith. This is like the establishment of two camps that I don't think are really the ones fighting in this war. I don't think the camps that are fighting in this war is the queer lovers and the queer haters, okay? The homos and the homophobic, I don't think that's really the primary motive of the war. If it was, I would still just say, then that further just emboldens the position of Ukraine, in my opinion. I don't know. I feel like this is all a stretch.
Putin regards the current West to the point of absolute untrustworthiness, particularly on the cultural and religious front. He is driven by economic and political necessity to trade with us and us with him, so that Russia can be supplied by much needed hard Western currency, and Europe in particular with fossil fuel. But Putin constantly tells his people that he sees us falling far too far under the sway of ideas very similar to those that produced the revolutionary frenzy of the communist movement. He is certainly able and willing to use the story of our degeneration to make his people wary of us and to convince them of the necessity of his leadership and to unite them in supporting his actions in Ukraine. And are we degenerate in a profoundly threatening manner?
What?
I think the answer to that may well be yes. The idea that we are ensconced in a culture war has become a rhetorical commonplace. Is it serious enough to increase the probability that Russia, say, will be motivated to invade and potentially incapacitate Ukraine merely to keep the pathological West out of that country?
No. 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 Ukraine is somehow, at the same time, a degenerate, drug-taking homo state where the women have taken control of the men, and a neo-Nazi, ultra-fascist, conservative state at the same time. How? How can these two realities exist at the same time? Where Ukraine is led by the gays and the Nazis at the same time, led by Western degeneracy and neo-Nazi, like, theocratic style obedience to what the government says is culturally and morally acceptable.
When the Biden administration began the process of identifying a new Supreme Court justice, a singular message was initially trumpeted. It is time for a black woman to take her place in the highest tribunal in the land.
Dude, I'm sorry. This has nothing to do with Ukraine. Why? Why? I feel like this is like he's trying to take his niche issues, or issues that conservatives have generally in the United States, and are trying to see how they can fit this square peg into a round hole at any point, at any way possible. And he's placed the peg on the hole, and he's just hammering it, just doing everything he can to make it fit. Could you imagine walking up to a Ukrainian? Their house is burning. They just lost their whole family in a rocket strike. Terrible. God awful. I don't even know how to approach somebody and like start to comfort somebody going through that type of pain, right? Could you imagine me walking up to them, patting them on the back, going, "They're there. I'm sorry that Joe Biden nominated Miss Jackson to be a Supreme Court justice." They'd look at me like I was insane. Most Ukrainians don't even know who that is. Like, this has nothing to do with the invasion. This isn't a civil war over the idea of degeneracy. It's just a smaller talking point to just try to demonize the West. That's what it is.
I thought this was a terrible strategic error. Speaking as someone who would rather see the Democrats sane than deluded, why not first announce the search for the most credible candidate and then report the discovery of the candidate with ethically fortuitous sex and genetic structure? Why wouldn't that sequence make the most sense? From within the Democrat fortress itself, the fact of qualification made primary and the secondary provenance that such qualification could be provided by someone who would also simultaneously serve as a beacon to the striving minorities and underprivileged. But no, sex and race were first. This begs the question, does qualification even matter? Now, technically speaking, announcing a priori restriction of the candidacy to women and black means the restriction of the potential pool of candidates by 50%, the approximate relative prevalence of women versus men, and then that half by an additional 87%, as black citizens of the US constitute 13% of the population. So that is an a priori restriction of the probability of picking the most competent candidate by 100 minus 0.5 times 0.13 equals 93.5%. That's a tremendous restriction. That means that it is so important to pick a black woman, not my words, that 18 out of 20 potentially qualified contenders.
I'm sorry, this is fucking stupid, okay? I can put up with it for a second. If someone makes a quick deviation to make a point, then rears right back in, I'm like, okay, got it. I understand it. He's completely gotten off the tracks. This is fucking stupid. This has nothing to do with the war.
And that restriction, which is unwarranted except for the direst of reasons in my estimation, given the crucial importance of the position, is an error, in addition to the error of putting the cart before the horse in the first place. And the 99.9th percentile, in terms of competence, is the difference between the best person out of 100 and the best person out of 1,000. This is a difference so big that the consequences can be, and have been, world-changing. A difference that is particularly important when the position in question is of crucial significance. I tweeted out something in this regard.
I'm not even listening anymore.
You are correct in a technical sense, but you radically underestimate the degree to which such appointments have been made
Oh my God, he's
for
still
political
going.
reasons in the past. Reasons that also reduce the pool of potential candidates to an arguably equal degree, a priori, but which weren't linked so obviously to race and sex. You are inflaming racial tensions by objecting, and that's not helpful, etc. Now, I take the people who told me this seriously, and I backed off. In some sense, I thought, okay, I'll give you all that. I still think it was utterly foolish and pandering of the worst and most unforgivable sort to announce the necessity of a black woman first, but your criticisms of previous appointments may be on point. I also think that the probability that she was the most qualified candidate is close to nil. And I think that most people who think like me, including those directly involved in the hearings which led to her eventual qualification, felt the same way. She was certainly not subject to the same roasting over a slow fire that characterized the hearings for the previous Republican nominee Kavanaugh.
Come on.
But it remains
Snap
true
out
that
of
sex
it.
and
We're
race
talking about
trumped
Ukraine.
qualification.
No, we're not talking
and
about
a moral
the
case
black
was made
woman.
for that decision.
No, Ukraine.
And that in and of itself does not provide
Grandpa,
indication
wake
of
up.
Western
Wake up.
derangement.
Please.
But
Please.
the very straightforward question, what is a woman? Which, granted, was a gotcha question, which only goes to show the severity of our current level of derangement, and so is no excuse for failure to answer. She said, I'm not a biologist. That is not a good answer. Now, she well knew that the question was a setup, as did the interview.
We're now talking about trans people. We're talking about trans people now. We've jumped from the Supreme Court nomination of Miss Jackson to her being asked about what is a woman. So now we're over to trans people. Again, the topic is Ukraine. The topic is the invasion of Ukraine.
In consequence, she evaded the issue entirely, but in a manner specifically designed not to antagonize the appalling radical left. And I'm even willing to grant her the moral right to do that, given that no one wants to be pilloried, and that no one should be subject to mobbing merely because they give an answer to a question, the answer to which is evident to anyone who maintains an iota of sanity and integrity. At precisely the same time that we were also enjoined to remain entirely dubious, again on moral grounds, that any such category as sex even validly existed. There is a principle.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm done. We're speeding this up. We're speeding through it. We're going 2 times. Okay. I signed up for a video about Ukraine and the complexities of foreign policy. Okay. As much as some of the earlier points I disagreed with, some of them I agreed with, we're just completely off topic. This is completely unrelated. We're speeding up this. We're getting through it.
Why? Well, because if you can claim that a thing is what it is and what it is not simultaneously, then you can claim anything whatsoever. And if you can claim anything whatsoever as true, then it is impossible to talk with you. You have departed from the sphere of reason and reasonable discourse. You have departed from the realm of the rational. This means that you have become deranged. This means that you have become degenerate. This means that all who fail to call you on your deranged degeneration have become rowers on the same doomed boat. This means that you and all those who do not call you out have become insane. All sexual proclivities and desires, no matter how rare, dangerous, or socially disruptive, are not to be merely tolerated, but must be celebrated.
Okay.
Pride Month, outright, or else. And
you gotta define which ones are socially disruptive. Like, is somebody being gay socially disruptive? Is that social disruption bad? It's kind of like a wide net to cast out here. I agree if somebody's sexuality is, I don't know, like, I like to go kick babies or something, that I would be like, okay, that's bad. But I don't think that's what we're referring to here. Am I just being a woke moralist of mine? Like, what? I don't understand what this has to do with this.
But sex is simultaneously so dangerous that every such interaction, to take a single example, between young men and women on campus is to be regarded as deeply and patriarchally exploitative in its intrinsic nature. Tantamount, even if voluntary, to rape, as Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon have insisted.
Who is saying that having sex on campus is inherently rape? I don't know who either of those people are. And you want to know why? I don't know who either of those people are, because I'm interested in the Russia-Ukraine war, not insane theories about sex, about how if you ever have sex with a man, that's rape or something. Like that's ridiculous. Of course it's ridiculous. But this has nothing to do with Ukraine.
And therefore necessarily preceded by the establishment of explicit consent formulated to a degree of precision that would hold in court under adversarial challenge in our society. Furthermore,
he is talking about Ukraine the same way how I will write a paper in 24 hours when I don't know anything about the subject topic and I just need to get a D to pass the class. Like, I'm just writing whatever I can think up at the time, just throwing it out there.
The difference between men and women is held to be purely cultural, even at the level of physiology. There are no markers, even genital, that allow for the reliable discrimination of infant boys from girls. While whatever differences may still be held to remain, are trivial biologically, negligible in the impact of their existence on destiny, and easily, properly, and necessarily modifiable culturally. Do not bother the radicals. And they are...
Who cares? I don't care. All of this is unrelated to the topic in question. And it's not like none of these issues deserve discussion. But if I go into a movie and I go into that movie to watch, I don't know, Fast and Furious, and I walk in and it's the Minions movie, while it would be a pleasant surprise, it would still not be what I signed up for, and I'm going to be a little perturbed.
Far more radical than they even know,
topic?
Who wish fervently to destabilize our society, to end capitalism, to destroy the free market, to bring down the oppression of the Enlightenment, to undermine and destroy the Judeo-Christian or even Abrahamic axioms that undergird our culture, and to dance in the resultant flames with glee while doing so. And if you don't think these ideas are under assault in some serious way, you are blind, and willfully so, and heading for a pit. Are not the Russians and the Hungarians and the Poles and the Indians, to a lesser degree, watching and thinking, those people have gone out of their minds? And we have, to say it again, clearly, the culture war in the West is real.
That's the tie-in? All of that was for that tie-in for Russia to say, well, that's crazy. That's the mic drop moment? Vladimir Putin looks over to the West and say, well, that's crazy. Anyway, hand me over my crocodile and my vodka bottle so I could bash it over my wife's head under my new making it easier to beat your wife legislation. Oh, and I see a homosexual in the street. Be sure to get a lynch mob ready for him. Like, man, those Westerners sure are crazy with their gender-affirming care for trans kids. And I think I might actually wrap it up here. If this has anything to do with the war, and any of what he just said had played at all into Vladimir Putin's thought process when he made the executive decision that they were going to invade Ukraine, this makes the invasion of Ukraine the most pointless war ever fought in the history of human beings existing and fighting with one another. If the reason he invaded was because of the schizo rant Jordan Peterson just said, which had nothing to do with the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine, their resource relationship, their economic relationship, or the relationship between NATO and the Russian bloc. Nothing. I'm sorry. It has nothing to do with it. I think we're wrapping it up here. I actually don't want to do it anymore. I'm going to call Lonerbox. Yeah. What was this video by Jordan P? I didn't even finish it. I'm done. I just don't even want to listen to it anymore.
It's when he got to that, there's the fourth reason.
Once he got to like trans kids, right? I was like,
Yeah.
this has nothing. What does this have to do with it?
Yeah. I mean, have you not ever seen a trans person just kind of expressing themselves and you're like, fuck, I need to like post on Twitter and then invade a country.
None of us give a damn about Ukraine and never have. Remember the Holodomor? None of
I'm sorry. Nothing could have prepared me for how he pronounced that. Nothing could have prepared me.